I'm Tammy Kevwich, the owner of Western Sky Multimedia and the secretary for the Park County Local Advisory Council, which is the local mental health board. And I'm sitting here with Karl Rosston. Karl is Montana's suicide prevention coordinator. And Karl, I've been to a couple of your presentations, and I felt that if all Montanans would come to one of your presentations, that we would definitely be able to make a difference in Montana suicide statistics. People who are not suicidal need this information because there's things that people can do. Can you tell us how it came to pass that your position got created and exactly what you're doing?
Sure. My position was created out of the 2007 legislature. There was a bill that created an office for suicide prevention, and created my position, and it was to provide training and promote prevention services and interventions throughout the state of Montana for all populations, to provide funding for communities for small grants to enhance their intervention services and their protective factors that they have.
Talk to us about what Montanans should know about suicide prevention, and your presentations.
Well, one of the first things that people should know about is that this has been an issue for Montana for nearly 100 years. We've been in the top 5 for suicide for over 40 years, and if you go back to 1918 when the Office of Vital Statistics was created, we've been a top-tier state for suicide every single year. The national rate of suicide is right around 12.4 per 100,000. Montana is about double that, anywhere between 22 to 24 per 100,000. And each year we are losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 230 to 240 people each year to suicide.
That's why we're doing this project, and I want to thank you for the service that you're providing. If somebody knows that one of their loved ones is having suicidal ideations, or they suspect that a loved one might have suicidal ideations, what can they do right now? What recourse?
Well, I think the first recourse that I would suggest is people have to learn the signs first. I find that most people don't know what to look for, and many times we have a tendency to dismiss or not put the pieces together, or understand how the pieces fit together. So raising awareness is probably the first thing, getting people to understand what to look for in their loved one or others in their community. At that point, we really have to understand, we have to start to address the stigma that exists in our state. And the primary stigma that we have to deal with is the stigma against mental health issues, specifically depression and anxiety. If we focus just on suicide, we're going to miss the boat, because suicide is just a symptom of a bigger issue, and that is undiagnosed and untreated mental health issues. We have that cowboy mentality in our state, where we take a lot of pride in ourselves, and we want to take care of others. And many times we see depression as a weakness, or we see depression as a burden. And that is one of the things that separates Montana and the Rocky Mountain region from other areas of the nation that have much lower suicide rates, is that, especially on the East Coast, there's a much greater willingness to talk about issues, to seek mental health care. In Montana, there's a shame associated with it. And so the tough piece about this is that this is a cultural issue. As I said previously, we've had this for 100 years, and it's going to take a cultural shift in thinking, and that's going to take some time. But we have to start by first raising our awareness, and then agreeing that it's okay to talk about these issues. After recognizing the awareness, right, and understanding what the signs are, the next big piece of it is for us to be able to talk openly about suicide. There's a lot of people that are very scared to bring up the word, and that is one of the greatest downfalls, though, where we don't have open discussions about it. There's a lot of people that have a fear that if they bring up the word, that they're going to put the idea in someone's head, and there's no research at all to support that. On the contrary, someone who feels suicidal feels very isolated, feels very alone, nobody understands them. There's an incredible fear of being judged. And so us not bringing up the word often only makes the issue even worse for the person. The best thing we can do is, if we see those warning signs, is to ask the person directly if they are suicidal. Bringing up the word. You can do no harm by bringing up the word suicide. If anything, it validates their pain, it opens communication, it lowers anxiety, it reduces the risk of impulsive behavior, and it forms a connection. And when we talk about the connection, it's important to understand that probably one of the biggest factors we know about suicide is a relational issue. It's about the relationship they have with other people, or the conflictual relationships they have, or loss of relationships, or even absence of relationships, especially in a rural place like Montana.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime that we can talk directly to somebody about it, we are reducing isolation and enhancing the interpersonal connection that people have.
Is there a connection between poverty and suicide that you see?
There's a number of factors, especially in Montana, that contribute. Poverty is one of the positive risk factors. We have, in Montana, we have 160,000 people who are uninsured, don't have access to any type of health care. We also have a large portion, about 18% of our kids under the age of 18, who live 100 to 200% below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. So socioeconomic factors do play a role. The first thing concerning people, how many people have been affected by suicide in our state, we know from the research that for every completed suicide you have 6 survivors, meaning 6 spouses, siblings, children who have lost someone to suicide. Well, if you take a look at our state, and we have 230, 240 suicides each year, that's approximately 1,300 to 1,400 new survivors every single year. Times that by 40 or 50 years, and you start to see how many people in our state have been affected by suicide. Yet the problem is when you throw in the stigma. When I go around and do trainings and presentations, just about every time I have someone come up to me and tell me their story. Mm-hmm. They lost a child, they lost a sibling, they lost a parent, and most of the time they tell me they haven't talked about it. And that's where the guilt, the shame, and the stigma comes in. Mm-hmm. The problem that we have is that we also know from the research that a survivor of suicide is 3 times the risk of completing suicide themselves.
Very interesting.
We have a lot of people who are living in pain or at a high risk that don't need to be. If they had a venue to be able to talk about their pain and there was an openness, we would be able to reduce the risk a great deal.
Are you aware of any suicide support groups?
We have there's suicide support groups starting in numerous towns around the state, and we provide training opportunities for facilitators and resources for any community that wants to start a survivor group.
You would want to say to people who don't really feel like suicide has touched their lives, they don't really feel like it's impacted their lives?
Chances are it's only a matter of time. And I think that's a big piece of it is eventually, I train a lot with law enforcement, and I tell new officers all the time, I always ask them if anybody's had any experience with them, and most of them say, well, some of them will say no at all, and I said, well, appreciate it while it lasts, because if you're in Montana long enough, you will come in contact directly with someone who has issues of suicide. There's just too many people each year, and it's been going on for too many decades for people not to have a connection to it.
So basically what I am hearing from you, that what's needed is a shift in perception, a shift that's going to remove the stigma. It's going to let people understand that to get help is actually a strength, not a weakness, and certainly no cause for shame.
I'll go back to the phrase I use, a cultural shift in thinking. Mm-hmm. That depression is a normal thing. In most cases, it's a biological medical condition, and we're evolving as far around our treatment, where we now know that depression is one of the most treatable of all psychiatric disorders, with a combination of sometimes medication, but also counseling. Help is available, mm-hmm. And for people to recognize the importance of treating and dealing with depression will be a key to reducing the suicide. And I see, especially with parents, There's a large portion, I think it's about 86% of parents who lost a child to suicide didn't even know their child was depressed. So recognition by parents, working with, even in the elementary schools and in other programs on enhancing coping skills and teaching people resiliency skills is essential, because one of the things we say is suicide occurs when the pain exceeds the ability to cope. If we improve our ability to cope, if we improve our resiliency skills, we stand a better chance of decreasing the number of suicides. And the best place that we can do that is in our younger generation, where they're easily molded and can learn new skills so much easier.
I have a question about my own suicidal ideations that I had not too many years ago. It certainly wasn't the first time that I had them. I had had them over the years, and it pretty much became part of my coping mechanism to think, well, if it gets too bad, I could always commit suicide. You know, after many years of a lot of stress, I found myself in incredibly dire circumstances. The thought of suicide did something that it hadn't done before, and that was that it brought me comfort. It was like I was actually comforted by the thought of committing suicide. And so I just wanted to ask if you could speak to that.
There's a couple pieces when we talk about that comfort that you had around suicide. We actually call it the rebound effect. And one of the things that's important to understand about depression is that we don't come out of depression quickly. It takes time. Even the best medications take 3 to 4 weeks at a minimal, if not 6 to 8 weeks. But for a lot of people who are severely depressed, there is an emotional pain that is overwhelming, it's all-consuming. I often kind of compare it to like an emotional migraine, where they just want the pain to end. And one of the things that happens is all of a sudden suicide becomes a viable solution to ending the pain. It's the light at the end of the tunnel. And what you might notice is that that once they come to this conclusion that suicide is the only way to end their pain, their affect will actually improve dramatically.
Did you say their affect?
Affect.
What is that?
Their mood can actually improve quite dramatically over a short period of time. And so I always emphasize to people, if you ever see someone who seems like they snap out of depression, be concerned. We know from the research that the greatest risk of suicide is not while somebody's in the depths of their depression. It's in the first 90 days that the depression starts to lift. And that's an important piece for people to understand. And even people who maybe have had to be in an inpatient setting, whether it's like a Shorter Children's Hospital or the State Hospital at Warm Springs, the highest risk of suicide is not while they're in the facility, it's actually in the 30 days after discharge. So there is that piece that
very important.
Yeah.
You know, this is important. Anybody who might be out there that is suicidal to understand that as you're getting help and stuff, that there are vulnerable periods in your recovery. You'll need plenty of support.
And there's another key issue when we talk about suicide is there's a role of ambivalence in suicide. And what I mean by ambivalence is very seldom do I ever see someone who's 100% sold on killing themselves. There's a part of them that wants to die and a part of them that wants to live. And that's one of the reasons why, like overdoses is seldom the cause of death. Because with an overdose, you get a second chance. You get time. You get fight or flight kicks in. You don't get that time when a firearm is involved. But people often change their mind. We know that about 90% of the people who attempt suicide and don't die will not die by suicide. People who are able to survive often are able to see that this is not what they wanted. Okay, but we have to have that time to be able to give them the opportunity to see that maybe they don't really want to die. And one of the important things is when we talk about the warning signs, and one of the warning signs we always talk about is they start talking about death, they start talking about dying, they write about it, or even talking about suicide. Understand that the part of them that it talks about wanting to die is actually the part that wants to live, and it is a cry for help. Okay, it's not the part that wants to die, it's the part that wants to live, and they want someone to care and someone to connect to them.
Absolutely important information.
When we talk about the warning signs of suicide, it's important to note that it's not just one factor. It's understanding not only how the factors play together, but also if the person has always been that way, that's not as much of a concern. It's if the person is acting out of character, that they didn't used to be this way, and then all of a sudden they're starting to talk about death, or all of a sudden they're starting to withdraw, or all of a sudden they're increasing their drug or alcohol use, or they're having sleep disturbances, deterioration in hygiene, giving away possessions, all things that all of a sudden are out of character for the person. And to tie it into the relationship piece, I always say that how do you know if someone's acting out of character unless you know what their character is in the first place? So there has to be a real emphasis in our small communities where we know our neighbors and that type of stuff, to really have a relationship with people, because then you're going to recognize when something is different. So this has been about 7 years now that I've been in this position, and I've been pretty much every corner of the state, training all populations from teachers and kids to the elderly, to law enforcement, primary care, bartenders, cosmetologists, anybody that has access or has a lot of contact with high-risk folks.
Karl, thank you very much for being willing to do this interview with me.
Thank you
so
for
that
having me.